All right, let's get right into it. We're going to break down one absolutely chaotic 24-hour period where a political party was, well, pushed right to the edge. The source material we're looking at here paints this incredible picture of secret phone calls, last-minute meetings, and a very public rebellion that really just rocked the entire political landscape.
You know, the source for this explainer doesn't pull any punches. It kicks off with this quote, basically saying that what went down wasn't just some minor squabble over policy. No, this was a huge deal, a seismic event, the kind of internal political meltdown that hasn't been seen in decades.
So that leads us to the big question, right? How on earth does a party's discipline just completely collapse so dramatically, so fast? We're going to trace the key moments pretty much hour by hour to figure out exactly how we got here. To really understand this whole revolt, we have to go back to the very beginning. It all started with a single phone call in the dead of night that lit the fuse for everything that was about to happen.
What's just wild about this timeline is the speed of it all. At 2:17 in the morning, you've got a demand and a threat. By 6:30 a.m., leaked audio turns that private pressure into a massive public insult. And then, just over an hour later, the 4 top Senate Republicans are in a room making a decision. The source suggests that in that crucial 47-minute meeting, the call was made. It was time to fight back. So how does a private decision made by 4 guys in a room suddenly explode into an open political war for everyone to see? Well, let's walk through the timeline. I mean, for Washington, this is moving at light speed. By 9:15 in the morning, a coalition is already being built. Before lunch, there's a formal letter, and by the time people are getting back from lunch, the confrontation is direct. But the key moment here, the real strategic move, is that 3 p.m. leak. Let's be clear, according to the source, this was no accident. This was a deliberate choice to go public and make it impossible for anyone to back out.
This quote, this is what the source calls the earthquake moment, the defection of Lindsey Graham. For one of Trump's most reliable and vocal defenders to come out and say there is a line and he just crossed it, well, that sent a powerful signal. This wasn't about loyalty anymore. Some fundamental principle had just been broken.
By the end of this one single day, the revolt had a number, 17. That's how many Republican senators put their names on that letter, publicly opposing Trump's demands. This wasn't just a few rebels anymore. This was a pretty significant chunk of the party, now in open rebellion. Okay, so the big question is, why now? After years of pretty solid party unity, what suddenly changed? The source argues this wasn't just some emotional outburst. It was actually the result of 3 very specific pressures all coming to a head at the exact same time.
So let's break these down because according to the source, it's this perfect storm, this combination of 3 factors that really changed the whole political calculation. You've got a threat to their jobs, a threat to national security, and a threat of serious legal chaos.
First up, let's talk about the brutal math of getting reelected. The source points to polling data just like this, showing a devastating new reality for these senators. In those key swing states, the ones that decide who's in charge, a generic Republican is actually doing okay. But the second you tie that same candidate to Trump, they drop. That's a 6-point negative swing. For a lot of these folks, that's the difference between winning and losing. That's game over. Second, there's what the source calls the Greenland disaster. This is all about public comments made about invading an allied country. The analysis argues that this wasn't seen as some clever negotiating tactic. It was seen as just dangerous instability. This quote from a retired 4-star admiral is used as proof of the alarm bells going off in the national security world, which put a ton of pressure on some key senators. And then there's the third factor, legal jeopardy. The source points to this growing fear inside the party's own legal circles, and it's summed up by this pretty chilling private comment. The idea of nominating a candidate who could literally be in federal custody by the election, well, for many, that was a political risk they just weren't willing to take anymore.
Now, to really get why this revolt was such a huge deal, you got to understand the power dynamic that was in place up to this point. The source describes it as a system of authoritarian control. It's all based on fear. You make an example out of a couple of dissenters to make sure everyone else stays in line. But that brings up a really important question. What happens when the fear of staying loyal becomes even greater than the fear of rebelling? So, with the Republican Party basically in an open civil war, the whole political chessboard got flipped over. And this created a really critical strategic choice for the Democrats. What were they going to do? Well, the source claims the Democratic leadership made a very calculated decision. See, if they attacked, they risked uniting the Republicans against them, a common enemy. But staying quiet, that was like a form of political aikido, using their opponent's own momentum against them. By staying out of it, they made sure the entire story was just Trump versus his own party, leaving him with nobody else to blame. And this slide shows the result of that whole strategy, combined with the revolts. The source calls it an encirclement. Suddenly, the pressure was coming from everywhere. His own leadership in the Senate, major corporate donors, worried allies overseas, and even parts of the conservative media. He was, for all intents and purposes, isolated.
So, all of this brings us to the most critical question of all. Where does it go from here? The source lays out 3 possible scenarios for what could happen next.
Here's the probability breakdown from the source material. A full-blown rupture and a complete backing down are both seen as having about a 25% chance, but the most likely outcome, sitting at 50%, is a tense stalemate. The source doesn't see this as a solution, but more like an uneasy truce where the conflict just keeps simmering, slowly drifting towards an eventual break. In this table, this is pretty incredible. It shows just how prepared the Senate leadership really was. The analysis claims they had war-gamed every scenario, and they came up with this 3-stage contingency plan. Stage 1 is simple, a press conference. Stage 2 involves committing massive amounts of money to defend their members from primary challenges. And Stage 3, the so-called constitutional option, means actually working with the other party to limit powers. They had a plan for every possible move.
And really, this is what it all boils down to. This is the single most important takeaway. This revolt wasn't about one vote or one issue. It represents a fundamental flip, an inversion of power. For years, defying the leader was seen as political suicide. This event, the source argues, is the exact moment that calculation completely flipped on its head.
And the source is really emphatic about this point. This was not driven by emotion. It was driven by cold, hard math. When the polling data, the big donors, and your own staff are all telling you that loyalty is going to cost you your job, the decision becomes one of calculated survival. The fracture, in other words, is structural. It's built into the system now.
And so we're left with this one final, very provocative question that the source material poses. It doesn't answer it, but it really represents the ultimate stakes of this whole conflict. When a major political party starts to tear itself apart, what does that mean for the stability of the entire system? So all of this brings us to the most critical question of all. Where does it go from here? The source lays out 3 possible scenarios for what could happen next.
Here's the probability breakdown from the source material. A full-blown rupture and a complete backing down are both seen as having about a 25% chance, but the most likely outcome, sitting at 50%, is a tense stalemate. The source doesn't see this as a solution, but more like an uneasy truce where the conflict just keeps simmering, slowly drifting towards an eventual break. In this table, this is pretty incredible. It shows just how prepared the Senate leadership really was. The analysis claims they had war-gamed every scenario, and they came up with this 3-stage contingency plan. Stage 1 is simple, a press conference. Stage 2 involves committing massive amounts of money to defend their members from primary challenges. And Stage 3, the so-called constitutional option, means actually working with